And the theory is that the U.S. uses force to keep this state of affairs in existence. And if they didn't use imperialistic force to force everyone to trade oil in dollars, then the value of the dollar would plummet and we'd be unable to maintain trade deficits without causing depreciation and inflation. And
Right.
if the cool stuff hypothesis is true, if people want to save in dollars because the US produces cool stuff that they want to buy and to be able to maintain their ability to buy even, when their income drops or when the exchange rate drops, then oil is only one of the cool things that you can get with a dollar. And loss of the ability to purchase oil in dollars from other countries would have only a small impact on the value of the dollar.
Welcome to Activist MMT, a podcast about real-world economics, including modern money theory, and how life changes when you discover it. I'm your host, Jeff Epstein. Today's part 2 of my 3-part conversation with lawyer and independent economics researcher Jonathan Wilson on the reality of the petrodollar or reserve currency, focusing on his unique and easy to understand cool stuff hypothesis. Jonathan's article on the topic can be found on his website pmpecon.com, and a link can also be found in the show notes. The cool stuff hypothesis is a realistic look at how and why a country's currency is desired, spent, and saved by people both in and out of the country. The playful phrase cool stuff was inspired by Stephanie Kelton and her 2020 book, The Deficit Myth, which takes 25 years of MMT academic scholarship and boils it down for a popular, non-academic audience. In part 1, Jonathan summarized his hypothesis, and today he continues that summary. We then connect the hypothesis to the ridiculous and hyperbolic theory of the petrodollar. In part 3 next week, we drastically change subjects. For the past 9 months, Jonathan has assisted me in developing a full and free online course that's not directly MMT, but is critical for those who want to better understand it. It's based on the work of Asad Zaman, who was my guest in episodes 56 and 57, and is titled Historical Context for Real-World Economics. The course is produced by Activist MMT and hosted by Bill Mitchell's MMT Ed and Isha Krishnaswamy's Historically. But for now, let's get right back to part 2 of my conversation with Jonathan Wilson. Enjoy. The products that other countries want, other people in other countries want to purchase, plus people in your own country. The total amount of demand for your stuff, your cool stuff, needs to be met. But there is the additional factor, which because we're not on the gold standard, I don't feel like I have this. This is a very vague understanding, but without the gold standard, there is more of an incentive to create essentially conceptual products, which you can create infinitely, which includes financialization, which includes gambling, which includes financial products. So you can meet the demands for those dollars, which essentially they're not out to buy products. They're not out to buy actual physical goods or services. They're out to buy more money. They're out to buy more money. And since you have the flexibility of not being stuck having to defend a gold stock, that you can create, and you have the flexibility to create that money to meet those financial needs, those gambling needs, essentially.
Oh, I see.
That feels reasonably close.
Oh, that is a completely different point than I was trying to. It's a very smart point, though. That's insightful. I'll have to think about that.
Wow, that was total accidental insightfulness.
Yeah. The point that I was making is that if there is a gold standard, it's a lot easier for the speculator, like someone who wants to gamble on a currency depreciating. It's a lot easier for them to track how likely it is that it'll depreciate because because the country that issues that currency is promising to convert it into one specific thing. And you can just look at that one specific. You have 1 million pounds of gold, and you put out $2 million worth of money converted, so 2 million pounds worth of money claims on gold. Okay, obviously I should speculate against you. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Yeah. So yeah, it's like if you know that they're converting it into one thing, you can just look at how much of that one thing do they have. Okay. But if they're not promising to convert it into any specific thing, and it's more of this abstract, claim on the goods and services of the country, it is a lot less reasonable for you to bet on a currency depreciation.
Huh. Okay. And I think my point about financial instruments essentially is they obviously existed under the gold standard as well. But it's just obviously it's much more risky because of the potential default on the gold standard itself.
Exactly. Yeah. So when there's no ability to have your peg broken, you can do a lot more things, and some of those things are going to be risky. Yeah. That's as much as I'm willing to say about that without giving it a real think.
Yeah.
But let's go back to
go ahead.
Yeah, let's go back to what you were saying about needing to produce enough stuff for your domestic consumption and for external consumption. So, let's keep it like a real simple model. I think in the article I talk about Canada and Japan. So let's say that Canada has a trade deficit with Japan of 100 Canadian dollars, and Japanese people, they want to save 25% of that and spend the rest. So let's say they want to spend 75 Canadian dollars worth of stuff. So Canada needs to be able to make $75 worth of stuff for the Japanese people, plus however much their own people want to spend. So let's say they want to spend, the Canadians want to spend $50 Canadian dollars on their own stuff. So if Canada has a $100 trade deficit with Japan, the Japanese spend 75 of those dollars back into Canada, buying stuff from the Canadians. The Canadians themselves want to spend $50 on stuff. 75 plus 50 is 125. So Canada as a country needs to be able to produce $125 worth of stuff. And if they can't, three things will happen. Either the Japanese won't be able to spend $75 and they'll get upset. They'll start selling Canadian dollars, and that'll cause the exchange rate to depreciate. Or the Japanese will get all their stuff, but there won't be enough left over for the Canadian domestic citizens to buy, and that'll cause inflation. Or most likely it'll be a combination of both. If Canada needs to make $125 worth of stuff to send to its own people and to the Japanese, but they can only make 100, most likely Japanese will get a little bit less. Maybe they'll get 65, and the native Canadians will get a little bit less. Maybe they'll get 35 or something, in which case you'll have domestic inflation and currency depreciation on the domestic market because your ability to buy stuff with Canadian dollars has reduced. And I like to think, and I'll have to talk to John Harvey about this, I like to think that this is not in conflict with his claim that it's not actual trade that determines currency depreciation, because I would say that it's not the actual trade, but it's the potential trade in this situation, if that makes any sense.
I actually just wrote down, I was going to ask you after you were done, of they have to meet that $75 of spending. So the Japanese choose to save 25 and spend 75, which means they're choosing to spend 75 now and 25 later. So clearly the US has to somewhat consider that future spending and be able to prepare for the productivity necessary to meet that as well.
Exactly. Yeah, there are expectations about future trade that are going to have major impacts on production and sale and depreciation. So if you're a Japanese business person and you've saved 25 Canadian dollars and you look and see that the Canadians, their economy is shrinking. They have not been keeping up with their ability to produce. There's been a drought and the Canadian timber forests are, drying up and burning away, and they can't make the stuff they need to make. You are going to think about selling some of your Canadian dollars. But in this case, it was not the mere fact that Canada ran a trade deficit that caused you to sell your Canadian dollars, because that would be sort of the classical view that John Harvey explicitly says is not the major determinant. It is the deficit plus that future expectation, sometimes speculatively, about their inability to convert those dollars into whatever the buyers are going to want. So I think there's that connection to trade, but there's also that speculative element, sort of looking into the future, considering how much you might need to save, considering what they're going to do, and partially considering what other people are going to do. John Harvey talks a lot about sort of foreign currency speculators influencing each other's behavior. And I think that's still, definitely sort of part of what you might see, because if you're a Japanese businessman who wants to buy Canadian timber or whatever, and you see that their forests have all burnt to the ground, you're going to start selling your Canadian dollars. And then your buddy is also going to start selling Canadian dollars because he sees what you're doing. So that possibility of sort of the groupthink is still there. And it can end up being extending a lot further than the immediate consequences of trade. But I still think that the connection to the production of real goods is there.
Actually, I learned this from John Harvey. I have a great interview with John Harvey about this, by the way. I interviewed John Harvey on exchange rate determination, and I spent 3 months preparing for it. I read his textbook. It is not easy. And I actually did several interviews in preparation for talking with John, and one of them happened to be with Sam on the core assumptions of mainstream. But something actually just for listeners, it is not an introduction. It's kind of intended to listen to after you get an introduction from like his interview on MMT podcasts and so on. But what I learned from him is that speculation creates its own reality. So speculators have incentive to manipulate to make their speculation come true. And in the age of the internet, that is not too difficult. Instantaneous communication around the globe to the other side of the globe makes manipulation very easy, especially since those in power I mean, Fed announcements, for example, are significantly manipulation. They're intended to shape behavior, and shaping behavior of foreign traders is a significant part of that. And actually, kind of a tangent is that the age of the internet makes things impossibly fast and also not personal. John was telling me about how you used to have to make a phone call to England to make a trade and talk to someone. So you would have to get to know that someone, and obviously you would be kind to them. If you're a complete jerk, they're not going to fill your trade. And, so you'll be kind to this person. You will think about this person. You will realize this person exists. But now with the internet, that's gone because it's so impossibly fast. You're doing thousands of transactions, millions of transactions in a second, and there's no person on the other end of that. It's just another computer. So the damage of your speculation is not as in your mind because you don't have the person on the other side. They don't exist to you. So obviously their suffering doesn't exist to you. So that's how speculation gets increased as well. So I addressed your point. Yeah. I addressed your point, and then I went significantly farther. So hopefully you can bring us back in.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And that speculation is, obviously like a huge problem, particularly with developing countries. The claim that I'm trying to make in the article, that I probably should make this more explicit, and luckily we are recording this in the past, so by the time the episode comes out, it will be made more explicit. The claim that I make in the article is that there's a limit to this speculation. So if you're trying to get everyone to sell your Turkish lira, because you have bet against the Turkish lira, you'll be able to do that up to a point, and that point is whether or not people outside of Turkey have liabilities denominated in Turkish lira, and that might be because they have a relationship with a supplier of Turkish goods, like a long-term relationship, like a contract to Turkey exports cars. Like maybe you said, all right, I'm going to buy 100 cars from Turkey every year, and I'm going to pay you in Turkish lira. If you have that relationship, that sort of trade relationship, then even if other people are selling their Turkish lira, you can't sell yours because you will need it to pay for those cars. So that's sort of the hard stop on the speculation, which is why people who tried to speculate against the Japanese yen keep losing. People say, oh, well, Japan has all this debt. Pretty soon they'll have hyperinflation. I'm going to bet against the yen. And they lose every single time because it'd be difficult to convince everyone in the world to sell their yen because they need yen to buy stuff from Japanese people because Japan makes so much cool stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the deficit myth is essentially manipulation, really. Yeah. It's essentially the people in power manipulating the general public to act foolishly, like the Widowmaker trade, which I don't know much about, but I know generally is like betting against the debt of Japan. And then they all got crushed because they believe the deficit myth. So the deficit myth itself, the scarcity myth, is essentially manipulation to keep those on top.
Yeah, like they want you to believe that the value of the Japanese yen is simply because some people have it and some people don't. And the more people who have it, the less valuable it is. But it's more complicated than that. It's why do they have it? What do they plan on doing with it? Where are they going to send it? In exchange for what? Under what terms? There's this deep sort of bargaining power analysis that I think you have to do that just is not present in a lot of conversations about the economy.
I think when you say the dollar is going to plummet or the yen is going to plummet, in reality, what you're saying is that the companies in the United States will not be able to produce the good things that they currently produce. Essentially, you're saying if the dollar plummets, you're essentially saying these companies are going to plummet.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense to say the dollar is going to plummet, because you're basically making a statement on the entire U.S. economy, every company in the U.S. economy, which is pretty strong. On
Exactly.
not great foundations, fossil fuels and all that stuff. But at the moment, the United States economy is quite strong. The companies in the United States are quite strong. So to say the dollar is going to plummet is basically betting on against every single company in the United States as a collective, and that seems pretty foolish to me.
Exactly, because there are like material realities of their ability to produce stuff that people are going to want to buy, and honestly and ironically, the only thing that could really threaten that is the one thing that our government doesn't seem to want to prevent, which is climate change. If we have crazy a tsunami that wipes out half of the West Coast because we continue to pump all this carbon into the air, then we actually won't be able to make stuff, and people won't want dollars. So it's crazy to me that we haven't put this at the forefront of our economic discussions.
I agree that big changes are coming whether we like it or not.
Yeah, I think to tie it back, like there are material circumstances that could lead to a massive undermining of the U.S. economy, but those are going to be a lot more important than any financial circumstances. Like it's not about the trade deficit or the debt. It's about, are we going to have a planet?
Sure. It's the causation is backwards.
Yeah. Anyway, so to briefly back up, there's this, we talked about a cascade of liabilities sort of strengthening the US dollar. And for people to say that the dollar is going to collapse, they are ignoring one crucial part of the cascade, which is the liabilities of companies who produce things, the liabilities that they have in dollars, and the fact that they will demand them. Anyways, we haven't actually talked about the petrodollar yet.
Right. So that was another question of mine so this all is your kind of alternative theory to the petrodollar. How does it connect to the petrodollar?
So the petrodollar came about as a result of like a series of international treaties and agreements decades ago, where we decided, okay, we're going to price oil in dollars. Anytime you buy oil from anyone, whether it's in Nigeria or Saudi Arabia, you're going to pay in dollars, as opposed to Nigerian. I actually don't remember what their currency is called. And then Saudi Arabia has I want to say the dinar, possibly, unless that's another country. I'm sure I'll be corrected on Twitter at some point. And the theory is that the U.S. uses force to keep this state of affairs in existence. And if they didn't use imperialistic force to force everyone to trade oil in dollars, then the value of the dollar would plummet and we'd be unable to maintain trade deficits without causing depreciation and inflation. And right. If the cool stuff hypothesis is true, if people want to save in dollars because the US produces cool stuff that they want to buy, and to be able to maintain their ability to buy even, when their income drops or when the exchange rate drops, then oil is only one of the cool things that you can get with a dollar. And loss of the ability to purchase oil in dollars from other countries would have only a small impact on the value of the dollar. So in the article, I give a list, and I'll go through it here because it's quick. So we already talked about aircraft and spacecraft. The other things that the U.S. is the top exporter of and the net exporter of is medical instruments, combustion engines, chemical products, refined petroleum, and arms and ammunitions. And they're not the top exporter, but they're among the top exporter of integrated circuits and unpackaged medicaments, which is essentially like the wholesale version of certain pharmaceutical drugs. And if you didn't have to buy Saudi Arabian oil in dollars, it would still be the case that you would need dollars to buy all those things we talked about. Guns, chemical products, medical instruments, integrated circuits, so on and so forth. Which means that at best, the complete obliteration of the petrodollar system would have a small impact of maybe 1 or 2% on the exchange rate, because you have all these other reasons to save in US dollars. And interestingly enough, the US is the largest exporter of refined petroleum. So there's crude petroleum and there's refined petroleum. And a lot of countries produce crude. Many fewer countries produce good refined petroleum. And the US is the top exporter of refined petroleum, which means that even if you couldn't buy crude petroleum from Venezuela in dollars, you could still buy refined petroleum from the US in dollars, which is what you really want in order to make plastics and gasoline and that sort of stuff.
And that brings up Fadl's work of they take in crude and they send out refined petroleum.
Yeah, exactly. So basically what I'm saying is that the US would be fine. So the second part of the petrodollar story, that if we didn't enforce this, it would fall apart, I think is complete bunk. The first part might still very well be true. The first part is that the US uses imperialistic force to create this state of affairs. Because I think there might be some people who benefit financially from the petrodollar system, and there might be other people who simply believe the second part of the petrodollar story. They think, we need to protect the petrodollar system so the dollar will have value. So let's, kill people to make sure that it stays in place. And Nathan Tankis wrote an article about this a little while back, and he talks about the second half of the petrodollar story. And like me, he comes to the conclusion oh no, the oil and gasoline, it's only a small part of trade. He doesn't get into the other things that the U.S. produces, but he concludes that it would be a negligible impact. I don't necessarily think they know that. They meaning George Bush. I think he might honestly believe that it would be the end of the U.S. because I think there are people whispering in his ear telling him, "Oh no, you got to make sure that Iraq continues to sell oil in dollars and not euros, and the same for Libya and all these places, because maybe they benefit from it. Maybe
that's what they define the U.S. as us.
Yeah,
the oligarchs.
Yeah, exactly. They're when they say we, they mean themselves.
Sure.
Maybe they make a lot of money from people converting their money into dollars, or maybe they just want to be able to surveil and see what people are doing, which is part of what happens if you're using banks that are connected to the Federal Reserve System to make these payments. It's a lot easier to keep tabs on everything. Yeah, so despite what they believe, what they actually believe, I don't think the loss of the petrodollar would have huge negative impacts on our ability to maintain trade deficits because we make all this stuff. And we sort of talked about this in the first part of the episode. If you couldn't buy any of that stuff from the US, you'd have to go someplace else. And if everyone went someplace else, those prices would increase and eventually get to the point where okay, well, now I feel as if I have no economic choice but to buy these things from from the U.S. and you need dollars to do that. So you would sell whatever your local currency is for dollars, so you can buy, the spacecraft, the integrated circuits, the medical instruments that the U.S. produces more of than most other places.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I have several more questions.
Let me just say one more thing before I get to your questions. And the purpose of writing the article was not to be like, oh, wow, the U.S. is so great. The purpose for me was to get people to think about this cascade of liabilities and payments and apply it to other countries, in pursuit of sort of, again, getting them to think about, like, what does sustainable development look like? Because and we're going to tie this back to Fadl Kaboob's work, which is that, if you're exporting low value content, what I would call uncool stuff that anyone can make, and there's no desire to save in that country's currency. So let's say you're Pakistan, to give a quick preview of what we're going to talk about later.
A very subtle, what do you call it in movies when you drop an unknown hint? Anyway, foreshadowing. Very subtle foreshadowing.
Yeah. Let's say you're Pakistan and you are producing like mass produced sort of, clothes and toys and that sort of stuff. People aren't necessarily going to want to save in Pakistani currency because they can get that from pretty much any place. They can get that from Indonesia. They can get it from China. So if you put out a bunch of money, if you run a trade deficit as Pakistan, people they're going to take that money and they say, okay, well, I don't want to hold on to it. So I'm going to, sell it, or I'm going to spend it. And that is either going to put downward pressure on the value of Pakistani currency or upward pressure on the domestic prices within Pakistan. But if Pakistan really develops, as Fidel likes to say, into high value added manufacturing goods, and they start making, let's see, what's something that's like really difficult to make, like X-ray equiment, and they become, yeah. You say transporters, like Star Trek?
Transporters, and the thing that makes food for Captain Kirk, Captain.
Okay.
Captain,
oh gosh,
the
what's
New
it
Next
called?
Generation one.
What is the thing called? Like the materializer?
Yeah, no, it's I don't remember the name, but Earl Grey tea hot.
Yeah. So let's say they make the transporters,
Picard,
and they're the only person, the only country in Southwest Asia that's capable of doing that. If they run a trade deficit, meaning that they're putting out more Pakistani money than they're taking back, then when you get that Pakistani money, you're going to want to hold on to it because you want to be able to buy the transporter. You want to be able to buy, the cool stuff that they're putting out. And what this means for development is that what you are able to manufacture is just as important as the sheer volume, because as your stuff becomes more advanced, you actually don't need to export as much. Because more advanced your stuff is, the more people will want to save onto your currency. And if they're saving it, that means they're not spending it, which means
not spending it now.
Yeah, they're not spending it now.
Preparing to spend it later. Yeah.
Yeah. They might be preparing to spend it later, or they might just be hoarding it because they know other people want it for whatever reason. Because we say that, saving now is spending later, but for a lot of like rich people, that's not necessarily the case. They just want to amass as much as possible, and they're never going to try to spend it all.
I mean, I see your point, but it's really that. I mean, that is the point: is to buffer for Armageddon, so that you'll always have something to protect yourself, which is essentially potential purchasing.
That's right. That's right. I mean, so yeah, but I guess like what I'm saying is the cooler the stuff that the country puts out, the bigger people's buffer is going to want to be.
Right.
Yeah. And that allows you a lot of sort of leeway. Anyway, so yeah, don't think about just the United States with this. Think about every country and what they can be doing and versus what they're actually doing. Just last night, I started a brief Twitter conversation with an economist who specializes in sort of industrial policy economics. And, one of the things he says is like, oh, countries need to focus on things that are going to bring in like good export revenue. And like one of the things that he mentioned, was like tourism and call centers. And from the MMT perspective, it doesn't make sense to invest in call centers as an industry for your country because that's so easily fungible. Anyone can do that anywhere. All you have to do is be able to, teach the people in your country English or German or French, and you can be, a hub for call centers. And if you start to want, better conditions, better pay for your people, and you start demanding higher wages, the people who own the call center, which are going to be people outside of that country, outside of Pakistan, it's going to be American, it's going to be Apple, it's going to be Google. They'll say, oh, well, you don't want to work for $2 a day at this call center. Well, the people in Indonesia have no problem doing it. So the more time you spend on this sort of quick cash, the less, like, there's a big opportunity cost between doing that and building up a sustainable sort of high value economy that's going to be able to like bargain for good conditions and also make people want to save your currency, which will allow you to spend it on things that you need, on more capital goods. So if you're Pakistan and you want to build I'm trying to think, what's something very difficult, like a factory that makes semiconductors, there's a lot of like really intricate equipment that you have to be able to purchase that you can probably only purchase from like Japan, Korea, Germany, the US. And if you spend, like a trillion Pakistani rupees so you can buy, this really awesome semiconductor equipment, people who have those rupees, outside of Pakistan, they're going to say, oh, I don't really need this because I can't really buy anything with it, other than paying people who work in a call center. So I'm just going to sell it, or I'm going to, quickly spend it on Pakistani goods, causing either domestic inflation or depreciation. But if Pakistan has already invested in more high value content, instead of sending people to work in call centers, you are, working on sustainable agriculture. You're working on sort of health and medicine and that sort of thing. When people get the Pakistani rupees, they'll say, okay, I'm going to hold on to this for a little bit because Pakistan has already improved the quality of goods I might be able to buy with it.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's part of this process of like slowly sort of building up your capacity. It can't happen all at once, but you have to be smart about it.
And you have to resist coercion.
You have to resist coercion, which is the toughest part. And it's a whole other topic that I want to get into about sort of interest rates and their effect on the cascade of liabilities. But I don't know if we'll have time. We can come back to it after you ask your questions.
Okay. Well, first of all, on the very important correction, not transporter, teleporter. Okay.
The teleporter, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, I have several questions. And we'll try and keep this 20 minutes so that we can get to the course. So that'll essentially be part 3. Yeah. So you said this is a description, like MMT. This is a description. It's not necessarily a good thing, but this is what it is. So like the fact that we make airplane parts in the U.S. and we make the best ones, and it's really cool stuff because nobody else does it at least as well as or whatever. That is what it is, but it's also a terrible thing because of climate change. And it's also a terrible thing because it's misguided from our point of view. If we want to be able to adjust and make money as climate crisis starts to take hold, then we need to start considering products that are going to be needed at that time. And if we cling on to products that need to be phased out, that's a bad thing. So as you say, as you end your article, I'm pretty sure it ends this way, that it's a description. This is a description of how it actually is. It does not necessarily mean it does not necessarily mean it's a good thing. And it's exactly the same pushback that you get from MMT. Oh, well, we should spend endlessly. No, they could. That's the point. They always could have.
It's a description. Like the dollar has strength because people need it to save. They need it to save so they can buy aircraft, spacecraft, medical instruments, chemical products, refined petroleum, arms and ammunition, integrated circuits, unpackaged medicaments. But that is a bad thing, unfortunately, because most of the things that I mentioned, planes, very bad for the environment, combustion engines, refined petroleum, obviously, arms and ammunition, very bad that we are
to the extent
arms.
That we do. Yeah. It's necessary to a small extent, but to the extent that we do is bad.
Yeah. A lot of conflicts around the world only exist because the U.S. sells so many arms. So it would be great if we focused, all of our output on, instead of planes, like what if the U.S. became the world's leading manufacturer of high-speed trains. And what if instead of refined petroleum, we became the world's leading manufacturer of solar panels? Those are both like still very complicated products that would, give strength to the dollar in a post-climate world. But we have to be smart and think, okay, we need to make these things for ourselves rather than just buying them from elsewhere, which has been the case for the last several years. There are some solar panels that are made in the U.S., but I don't anticipate us becoming the global leader in that.
Right. I think it's probably true that almost every oligarch, every billionaire is dependent on fossil fuels, like fundamentally dependent on fossil fuels. I mean, Bill Gates' computers, which is substantially dependent on fossil fuels for the creation and for powering computers. I mean, that's much less, but clearly much more is Musk with Teslas. That is big time dependent on fossil fuels to manufacture and to dig up all these harsh chemicals and to generate the electricity to charge these cars. Walmart is the whole point of Walmart is to have a very large store that you can go and drive to a distance away and get whatever you need. That can't happen if we don't have cars. And I'm pretty sure, and fossil fuel companies, obviously, military are obviously dependent on fossil fuels, or the biggest user of fossil fuels, I understand it, the U.S. military. So I think I lost my point, but I think all oligarchs pretty much are really dependent on fossil fuels, which is another reason of why they're clinging onto it. And I mentioned to you that kind of suggests a contradiction anyway. If the U.S. economy is dependent on the petrodollar, then that gives us an impossible conundrum where we either have to choose between having a livable climate and sticking with the petrodollar in order to save the U.S. economy, or saving our ability to live on the planet and getting off of fossil fuels, which, if the petrodollar theory is correct, will kill the U.S. economy by definition, by that theory. So, I'm pretty sure that we can reject that I'm pretty sure that that's false dichotomy. So,
absolutely. Yeah.
So
that would be a great takeaway.
Okay. And can you connect this to outsourcing, meaning the cool stuff hypothesis? Like the U.S. outsources a lot. So the fact that the U.S. dollar is such in demand implies that we have a lot of cool stuff, a lot of unique things that the world wants to buy. And yet at the same time, we outsource a lot. So I wonder how that fits in. And I'm thinking of two things. Number one, we do produce a lot, but it enriches the rich because our workers are overseas. A lot of them are overseas. And also potentially like iPhones, those things are constructed overseas and then we sell them as US products.
My inclination would be to talk about the second part of the explanation, which is that we send out a lot of really complex parts for things that are assembled elsewhere. So you remember that I said the U.S. is the leading exporter of combustion engines, but they're not the leading exporter of cars, which means that other people are using our combustion engines to make cars that they're selling back to us.
That's kind of the reverse of iPhones, where pieces are made overseas. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and the U.S. is a net exporter of integrated circuits, but a net importer of phones and computers, which means that we're sending out a lot of integrated circuits, which is the complicated thing. And they're putting the thing together and sending it back to us, at a markup. If you're just looking at the relationship between, integrated circuits and phones, you would see Americans spending, billions and billions and billions on phones, and South Koreans, or the Chinese more likely, spending hundreds of millions on American integrated circuits. And from a classical perspective, you look at that and say, oh, we're getting the raw end of the deal because we are sending out way more money. We're paying so much more. That obviously can't continue forever.
Huh.
But it can, because they need the circuits, the integrated circuits, more than we need the phones. I know that sounds crazy, but what I'm saying is that if they decided, oh, you know what?
We can choose other suppliers. They can't choose other creators of these unique products of phones.
Exactly. If the Chinese said, oh, we're not going to make phones for you anymore, we'll say, fine, the Mexicans will, or the Canadians will, or something. Or maybe, and this would be, a ideal scenario for me, is we just pay our people to make them for ourselves,
Yeah. Okay. So one brief statement and then one final question to close us out. My brief statement is that Warren made an interesting point to me that, Fadl's work is low value added content being sent out, exported. And then for example, Venezuela exports crude oil and imports processed fuel. And that's a bad thing. But it's not a bad thing because it's low value for high value. That's not what makes it bad. What makes it bad is that they are coerced into doing it. The coercion is bad, not the low for high. Because Warren gave an example of Australia exporting coal and getting televisions in exchange. So that to me came across as that's low value for high value. And Warren said, I reject that's a bad thing, and inherently a bad thing. And he didn't say so what I concluded from that, he didn't say this specifically, is that Australia chooses to do that, or at least in his, I don't know if it's a pretend scenario or not, but in that scenario, Australia chooses to do that. And there's nothing wrong with choosing to send out low value and getting high value, like raw materials for highly processed stuff. If you are coerced into doing that, that's a bad thing. So it's not low to high is bad. It's that coercion is bad. That's a statement I wanted to make. So my final question for you is, okay, so now we realize that the petrodollar, we understand that the petrodollar is kind of nonsense. It's just another cool stuff that is imposed on the world by the muscle of the US. But they have tons of other cool stuff. It's like kind of easy to say this. It's like half silly, but half like very convenient. The US has tons of other cool stuff. So removing the petrodollar would have some impact, but it really would not, it's like you said, like 1% or whatever, not that big of a deal. So the question is why do we have the petrodollar in reality? Why do we have it? Why does it exist?
It probably it's probably a carryover from gold standard thinking. Honestly, I think it was that gold was this super important resource that everyone had to have, and we decided for simplicity to trade in dollars. And then after the gold standard fell, we said, okay, well, what if there was something else? And also this had to do with sort of like the creation of OPEC. We said, this will be a lot easier for everyone else to deal with this really important good if we price it in dollars. Of course, it was always an illusion. That was the argument. Why does it still exist other than ignorance? Because let's assume that people know, or at least some people at the top have figured this out, that like obviously oil isn't the only good that you can buy with dollars. It sounds a bit conspiratorial, but I do think that it is currently in existence, and people try to keep it this way because it's profitable for them. Either because you're a financial institution and you get money from the fact that people, you're an American financial institution who does all these transactions in dollars, and you get like a little bit of the cut, every time, one of these transactions is made. It's either that, or perhaps more conspiratorially, if you are a manufacturer of weapons and you're part of the military industrial complex, you need the US to be involved in conflicts so you can sell bombs and missiles and guns and planes and tanks and all this sort of stuff. And the petrodollar is a convenient reason for the U.S. to be involved in these conflicts. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Okay. I never thought of that.
If you're the manufacturer of tanks, you want the U.S. to have a need for tanks. You want them to be involved in some sort of conflict. So, if you hear that,
well, we have the tanks, so we might as well use them.
Yeah, and if they use them, they get blown up, and then the U.S. has to buy more.
Huh.
And you might actually believe the petrodollar thing. You might think it's overblown, because it is. In fact, you probably know that it's overblown, but you'll be incentivized to make it seem even bigger than it is. So we talked about, it would be a small effect. If you manufacture tanks, you are incentivized to call the president of the United States and say, oh, no, this is a huge thing. We have to make sure that people continue to trade oil and dollars. Otherwise, the economy will collapse. Oh, okay. And by the way,
they're basically lying. They're basically lying. They're pretending that we have to, when really it's, I really, really, really want you to keep this.
Yeah. If you were bad and smart, the current incentives, if you are a manufacturer of weapons, is to call the president and say, we need to protect the petrodollar. Oh, and by the way, I have the weapons you need to do it. Mm-hmm. Give me money for these weapons so you can go do that.
Okay. That makes sense. And I don't really, I kind of reject the word conspiratorial. It's a theory. We have no way to prove it, but it's certainly a theory, and it's certainly worth considering looking into. And my theory, which I have no evidence for, but it just seems logical to make sense, which I've mentioned to you, is it is a very convenient way to basically keep tabs on every other country. because they
Yeah.
have to use dollars. So there has to be some logs of which country has what. And that is obviously updated as they purchase oil and whatever, or and especially if they choose to not, they try and create an alternative petrodollar or whatever, like go to the euro or go to the ruble or whatever, that is a very convenient way for the US to keep tabs on every other country.
Yes, because, at some point for all those dollar payments to clear, there's going to be some movement within the Federal Reserve System, and it's easier for them to sort of track that. Also, it's easier for them to put sanctions on countries. If you're
just flip a switch at the Fed. Interesting.
Exactly. If you have to spend dollars to buy oil, and you're a country that pisses off the United States, the U.S. can tell. Even if you don't have a bank account with the United States. So, let's say you're Afghanistan. You don't necessarily have a bank account at Wells Fargo, but maybe you have an account at Deutsche Bank in Germany, and they have a correspondent account with Wells Fargo, which is part of the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve can tell Wells Fargo, do not process any of your correspondent account transactions from Deutsche Bank that are originated from Afghanistan.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's true.
Whereas if that weren't the case, and if Afghanistan was buying oil in Pakistani rupees, then the only thing they would need permission for, the only entity they would need permission from would be the Pakistani central bank, because they could have correspondent accounts with Pakistani commercial banks, and the U.S. wouldn't have direct influence over that.
Mm-hmm. And some middle-aged white dude sitting at the Federal Reserve can just use a single finger to just change some number or some Boolean in a true or false in their computer, and cause this this real world consequence for whatever country they want.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's like that episode of Rick and Morty where they turn the 1 into a 0, and then they destroy the financial system.
I am not familiar. Now I have to go. Now I'm curious about that. Okay. All right. So any final words about the petrodollar, about your article? Say it now, and then let's switch over to the course.
Yeah. I mean, the big takeaway for listeners, and I hope you go read the article yourself, because there's a bunch of stuff that has left out, and there are some links to some other articles and cool resources. But the big takeaway is, consider this cascade of liabilities. It starts with the state, it moves to the individuals and companies, and then from there it moves to consumers, and some of those consumers are outside of the country. And this network of connections will only be as strong as the desire to save in whatever that currency is, which is dependent on how cool the stuff is that you can buy with that currency. And people who haven't read the paper are going to say, why do they keep saying cool stuff? It is a tongue-in-cheek thing.
But it's really convenient. It really is convenient to say that. And the countries who make the most cool stuff are cool countries. Exactly.
And the countries who don't make any cool stuff are uncool countries. It's really easy to remember, and it's fun to say. And that was something that I sort of came up with after reading The Deficit Myth, of like, all right, she uses very accessible language. So why don't I just, make this accessible and sort of attention grabbing? I'm just going to call it.
It's like
cool
half
stuff.
Embarrassing, but it really is half like really useful. It's very useful to just encompass it with that.
Yeah. It's fun. All right, so that's the end of that.
Okay, so let's switch subjects drastically. You have been really helpful. To give feedback on this course that we're creating. Actually, why don't you I could say generally. I guess I'll give the lead up of how kind of I led to you, how you got involved, and then you can take it from there. I'll just say briefly. So you're my first interview, at least recorded. I'm probably going to release Professor Zaman and hopefully, if it works out, Bill Mitchell to be the first interviews, and then I'll supplement it with. Then I'll release you, and then I'll release Uzma. So I interviewed Professor Zaman. I call him Professor Zaman. He's never told me to say differently, so that's what I do. I called Randy Ray. I called him Dr. Ray. I call Bill Mitchell Bill. I call Assad Zaman Professor Zaman. So I don't know. I just get stuck on how I choose to call them, and I never change it because no one never tells me to say it differently. So I met Professor Zaman. I saw his MMT videos, which is on the old version of the textbook, the pre-published version of the textbook. So he has a video per chapter, like 17 chapters. And I don't know how I discovered them, but I contacted him through that, and I did an interview with him in November of last year. It was released in November of last year. It's really good. It's really good. And in fact, the first hour is significantly the content of our course, which is kind of interesting. I'd be listening to it again.